Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. One of the themes that we always talk about on this show is how we can think of design as ideologies made artifact. That through the acts of design, we are cementing a point of view, a way of seeing the world, an idea about how to live. What design does is it takes these ideas and it makes them concrete in some way, so they in turn shape how we live. This is perhaps no more evident than in infrastructure. The roads we drive on or the trains we take, the access to water or the availability of electricity or high-speed internet that runs into our homes all creates a set of design systems that shape our lives in ways both big and small. To look at the design of infrastructure, then, is to see what is valued by a community. They give us clues about how to live and interact within them. This is the paradox of infrastructure. It can be both liberating and oppressive. It can give individual freedoms while limiting collective freedoms. In the wide-ranging new book, How Infrastructure Works Inside the Systems That Shape Our World, Deb Chachra shines a light on these systems that are so easy for us to overlook. I've been reading Deb for years, mostly through her excellent newsletter, Meta Foundry, where she writes about material science, feminism, and gender studies, and the intersection of technology and culture. So I was excited to have her on the show to talk about this new book of hers and so much more. We begin this conversation talking about infrastructure, how we define it, why we overlook it, and how we can rethink it to create systems that work for everyone. In the back half of the conversation, we talk about education. Deb is also a professor of engineering at the Olin College of Engineering and was instrumental in helping develop that school with the belief that engineering education could be taught in a different way. You'll find, I think, that what she's thinking about in engineering is completely applicable to design education as well. I feel like I learned so much from this conversation. If you liked this episode and what we do here at Scratching the Surface, I hope you consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus interviews, full transcripts, an exclusive monthly newsletter, and they help keep this show free for everybody. So you can head over to patreon.com/surfacepodcast to sign up and help support the show. Thank you for listening, and here is my conversation with Deb Chachra. I want to start with probably the biggest question, or maybe the hardest question, or maybe the easiest question. It's going to be one of those. What is infrastructure?
So it is, in fact, both the hardest and the easiest question. So the biggest version of it is we tend to use the word infrastructure for all of the systems that we take for granted that underpin the thing that we're actually trying to do. And so that's the broad sense in which you'll hear people say infrastructure a lot. For my purposes, for the book, I focused on networked infrastructural systems that are technological systems. So all of these are the things that we think of as utilities, right? So like water, sewage, electricity, telecommunications, utility gas, if you live in a place where you get, for example, natural gas to your house, transportation, right? All of the sort of like, when you say infrastructure, if you say utilities, these are the things you think about. So that's really what the focus of the book is.
Yeah, I mean, you say early in the book, sort of half joking, but also serious now, especially hearing you say that infrastructure is all the stuff that you don't think about. Can you tell me why that you don't think about it? That this stuff happens in the background, why that's important to this definition?
So it's really a set of enabling structures, right? It's typically a set of agreements so that you don't have to think about everything from first causes every time. And so, so for example, our monetary system is infrastructure, right? Like this is the thing you notice when you travel, right? When I go to the coffee shop, I don't have to think about how I'm going to pay for my coffee, right? It's like we all have agreed that I'm paying for it in US dollars, and there's if there's a card machine or whatever. Whereas if I went to a different country, I'm like, oh wait, like, is my bank card going to work here? Do I need
Right,
to,
right.
so like that. So it's the things you take for granted. There's sort of two reasons why we want to have things taken for granted, right? One is so that we just don't have to think about things all the time, right? We can do the
Mm,
things that we want to do. And that's what a lot of the purpose of infrastructure is for, to collectively do things together, where we can sort of take these sort of the way we do things for granted. But technological infrastructures typically provide for very basic or very universal needs, or both, right? So
mm,
water is both basic and universal. Communications, like telecommunications or transportation, are not survival needs, but they're absolutely universal needs, right? The the desire to communicate and to interact with other humans, right? Whether that's
mhm.
online or whether that's by getting into a vehicle and going to physically be where they are.
You write sort of towards the end of the book, you have this great line where you say, thinking of infrastructure as physical systems of networks and energy is only part of what we need to understand them as they exist today, much less the directions they'll be taking in the future. There are also human systems that incorporate particular ways of seeing, organizing, and acting in the world, which I think you were starting to kind of get to in that answer. And that's sort of the
Yeah.
subtitle of your book, this inside the systems that shape our world. Can you talk to me? I think for a lot of people, and even for me, when I was reading the book, I was noticing the way I saw this change. I think of infrastructure as physical. I think of the roads, the wires, the pipes. Can you talk about this human component, the cultural and political component of infrastructure here?
Yeah. So first of all, so the subtitle of the book is Inside the Systems That Shape Our World. And so one is, what are the systems that we choose to build out to be these kinds of networked
Right.
infrastructures, right?
Yeah.
So how do we make the decision that we're going to do this? And then the second piece is, once we have these systems in place, how do those systems then shape the decisions we make as individuals? And so something like water is I think of it as kind of the infrastructure, because it's kind of easy to wrap our head around, right? Everybody needs water to survive. We need water every day. You can't put it off and get it later.
Hmm.
And if you have a whole bunch of people who live close together, then it's very, very efficient to build a single system that takes advantage of the fact that water flows downhill and that water will happily divide and subdivide itself into networks to
Hmm.
deliver water to where people need it. Right. And it's clearly a
Yeah.
thing that makes sense to do collectively, because every single person will benefit from the system, because every human needs water to survive. But we can make a similar type of argument for transportation. We can make a similar type of argument for electricity, that the existence of these networks we sort of build these things together or collectively, and that enables us to do things as individuals. But the flip side of that is that once we have decided on these networks and built them out, that kind of changes what we can do. And water is actually, in a way, a weird example, because the thing I was going to say is, well, nobody ever gets um if you have water delivered to your house, you don't get water from somewhere else. And of course people do, right? People do get I like
Right.
seltzer, or like,
Right. Right.
people, buy get bottled water delivery.
Yeah.
But so water is a bit of a weird example, but nobody ever, you don't get bottled water to shower in or to do your dishes in unless your water is really not potable. So let me sidestep that for a second. But so if we collectively decide we're going to build out a network of roads, which we did, right, then in the US, then that sets up some possibilities. It makes it possible for you to drive to work or to drive, to your friend's house. But there's some decisions to not do things. So that means that it may be that you don't have a public transit network or a different kind of network. And
Hmm.
so the collective decision to enable certain pathways can often preclude other pathways. And the nature of infrastructure making some things much, much easier for everyone also often means it makes it much, much more difficult to do anything that's different than
Right.
that thing for
Right.
everyone.
Right.
And so that, it's that sort of famous line that first we shape our tools and then our tools shape us,
Yeah.
right? That first we decide that we're going to build these collective infrastructure systems, and then they forever, or at least for a very long time, they define what possibilities are open to us, to the point where we often don't even see them as possibilities anymore, right? It's like, of course I have a car, of course I drive to work, because the other possibilities have been so completely closed off.
I was really struck by this sort of central tension throughout the book between these extremes, that infrastructure is, it can provide freedom, it can
Mhm.
give you time, you don't have to think about these things, they give you
Yeah.
more time to do other things, but it can also be oppressive, it
Yeah.
can make you be the same, it can give
Yeah.
you accessibility in some aspects but inaccessibility in others, it can
Right.
create community, it can create isolation, and create standards, it can, while preventing innovation or alternates. And so how do we sort of negotiate this tension? How do we sort of um, understand these extremes at something of the grand scale of infrastructure?
So here's one way that I think about that. So I really love um so the developmental economist Amartya Sen, he talks about how he studied, some of the world's poorest communities,
Mm,
and his he wrote a book called Development as Freedom, and he really makes a case that the purpose of wealth and income, money basically, is to give us the freedom to live the kinds of lives that we have reason to value.
mm,
Right. So, and I maintain that, first of all, on a day-to-day basis, most of that side of it, the freedom to live the kind of life I have reason to value, for me, is actually provided by infrastructural systems, not by money per se. And because we
mm.
basically collectively use our collective money to build these systems to give us individual agency and individual freedom. And so this is why, for example, that unlike most brown middle-aged women, so most people who look like me, I don't spend my days getting clean water for my family or finding fuel for cooking, right? It's
Right,
like, it means I
right.
get to do other things besides that. However, so these systems enable possibilities, but they also, as we would think, sort of constrain other possibilities. So here's, another good example of this is that I have a car, and cars are really sold to us on the basis of providing freedom.
Right, right,
Right, that like,
right,
and it is true that if you have a car, you can just walk out of your house at pretty much any time of day or night and get in behind the wheel of your car and go, because we've built out the systems that make that absolutely possible.
mhm.
But I say, it's like, you can drive anywhere you want at any time of day or night, as long as you're not trying to get into downtown Boston at rush hour. And so they also constrain the things you can do. But also, like, even if you're driving, you are, I really hope, not doing anything else besides driving.
Right,
Right.
right,
It's like,
right,
it's like your commute is like, well, this is the thing you're going to do, for, it's about half an hour for me to get from my home in the city to the suburban campus where I teach. And it's like, for that half an hour, I'm not doing very much else besides driving. And correctly, it's commuting in Boston traffic.
right.
I don't get to be on my phone. I don't get to chat with my friends, and um so these systems that basically enable us, the sort of incredible freedom, also really constrain the ways in which we spend our time. And in fact, I have a car. I actually have a driver's license because the college where I teach is in the suburbs, and there's really no good way to get to it by public transit. And so I have the freedom of having a car. I am simultaneously constrained to using my car. In fact, the reason why I live downtown is because if I do want to get to downtown Boston during rush hour, I just take the subway.
Right,
Right? I
right.
have access to this whole other set of freedom. So that's an example of how these systems both provide us with tremendous freedom, but they also constrain the pathways that we go down, often in ways that we don't even notice as constraints. Right? They're just the way you do things.
I
Right?
think,
If I sorry.
yeah. Oh no, I think that's exactly right. And I think transportation is such a great example of that. And I'm going to try to phrase this as a question for you to sort of build on this. But I lived in New York for most of my adult life in New York
Right.
City, and left New York a couple years ago and got a car for the first time as an
Right.
adult. I had a car when I was a teenager, but first time driving again for a long time. um and I was sort of confused by my feelings around having a car, in that in many ways I had more freedoms to get around than I did in New York with the subway, which I love. Like I love the New York subway system.
Right. Same. Yeah.
Um, but I felt like the subway, gave me more freedom than the car, even though in reality, the car, I could get in the car anytime and go anywhere.
Right.
And so there was this like tension between, I have this thing that um in many ways is giving me more, but it feels like it's giving me less. And so the road system versus public transportation, or the personal car versus the subway, infrastructure at large is a way to sort of see what we value, both collectively, but also individually, because when I'm in the car, I'm isolated. Where I'm on the subway, I'm in the city, I'm with other people. And
Right.
that was set up through these, infrastructural systems.
Yeah. So cars, the ideal way to use a car is that you have your car and you have your road network and there's no one else on the roads. Right.
Right, right.
It's like and that's why like every car commercial you've ever seen pretty much just has a car like on the road and there were no other cars around. Right.
Right.
And um and so cars are really good at providing individual freedom, but public transit is actually really good at providing collective freedom. Right. And in fact, actually, like, like I lived in London I've, spent a lot of time in New York. I lived in London for 6 months. I did not have a car in London. And public transit actually works better when more people use it. Cars work worse when more people use them. And
Mhm.
and that, so that in that sense, like transportation is a really good example of how collective systems provide individual agency and in particular how they scale. And so the US, of course, famously made this giant investment into the individual freedom of roads, which worked, I would say, great, kind of okay in the 1950s,
Right.
and not very, and it works in the US. There's many places where it still works, right? The built environment is built to define, it's built to facilitate that. But there are, of course, lots of places, including most major cities, where it doesn't work very well. And further to that, and this is, I think the thing that's really been sort of showing up in the last sort of 10 or so years is we have a real understanding of the ways in which these systems, where if you have cars which are really good for individual freedoms and individual agency and like getting around as individuals,
Mhm.
versus cities which are really about places where there are a lot of people,
Mhm.
right? That cars don't work amazingly well, right? It's like, it's not just like to the driver you have to deal with traffic. It's like parking,
Right.
it's
Right.
traffic safety, right? It's, do cars play well with other people? And then, of course, there's the whole issue of, I said when I drive, I'm paying attention to driving and nothing else. And that presumes that I am, aware and capable and I'm not too tired. And, but also that I wear my contact lenses, right? And I'm over the
Yeah.
age of 16, so I can legally drive and I haven't started losing my senses, as which, as we age, we will all have this loss of capacity, right? That means that maybe you shouldn't be in charge of a 2,000-pound vehicle going at 100 miles an hour. And and so, we've invested so strongly in these systems that work well as individuals, and we're really starting to see the limitations of them in as they work as collective systems. And so, yeah, so like I think transportation is a really, the sort of cars versus public transit in cities is a really stark illustration of the sort of individual agency versus collective agency, and how we support sort of what you can do as an individual through building collective systems versus supporting what you do as an individual through, and of course cars also depend on collective systems in the form of roads, but
Right.
our sort of engagement with them is that as like an individual, and as you say, cars are isolating for exactly that reason, right? It's like you're in your car by yourself,
Right.
physically isolated from other
Right.
people, and that is not the case, for good or for ill. That's not the case on the subway.
I have a really weird question that I feel like we're sort of talking around in some ways, and I want to
Mm,
hear you sort of talk about it really directly, and maybe here's where we sort of shift from transportation to something like water, or
sure.
electricity, or natural gas or something, because I'm really interested in this idea that part of infrastructure is that it's this thing that we don't think about,
Right.
that it does liberate us in this way. And then your book is all about making us think about it.
Right.
It's about taking these invisible systems, these decisions that were sort of, made many times before we were born,
Right.
highlighting the ideologies of how these things come to be. And I want to hear you talk about the value in making these invisible systems visible. What what do we lose with not having to think about them? And then what can we gain from thinking about them again or thinking about them for the first time?
Right. So in a perfect world, it would actually be nice if we didn't have to think about these systems.
Okay.
Right. Like I don't, I'm not like
You don't want
like,
to
yeah,
write this book. Yeah.
yeah. And actually, one of my favorite ways in which you can think about the systems and not think about them uh is when so I live in a place that has a 1% for art for public spending. And so there's a water treatment plant, and 1% of the water treatment plant bought a bunch of really lovely public art. My hometown of Toronto just did a major sewage separation, like a stormwater separation process, which is really just like like digging up and rebuilding your sewers, and then nobody
Oh,
really
wow.
notices that anything has changed. And they built a beautiful, beautiful piece of public art on one of the sites where they do kind of stormwater remediation. And it's like that's kind of the way in which I think we should think about infrastructure. That we ignore it except for the fact that we have beautiful bridges and train stations and beautiful pieces of public art to tell us, that we've done this
Mm,
huge thing. Unfortunately, that we do not have that luxury. And we don't have it for a couple of different reasons. So one is we have a real understanding that these systems do not in fact work well for everyone. Right.
right.
And so
Right.
this is, the building highways through African American neighborhoods. This is understanding, traffic issues. This is, neighbor communities that don't have reliable access to clean water. This is inequity in internet access, which became a huge issue during the pandemic, right? Who has
Right.
good, basically making all of our civic services available through the internet, then who has good broadband and who doesn't. So the first piece is that we don't get to not think about our infrastructural systems because we didn't do a good enough job of
Mm,
making sure that the provision was universal. That's the first thing. The second piece is that our infrastructural systems, because they're the way that we act in the world and because we are material beings and it's a physical world, we need energy to do that. And most of that energy comes from combustion, right? It comes from burning fossil fuels, which puts CO2 in the air. So if to move your like actual physical, body through the world or to do anything with it, to do your laundry, to fly to the
mhm.
other side of the planet, to talk to your friends over the internet, all of these things require energy. Historically, in human society, most of that energy has come from burning things. And we are understanding the limitations of that, right? What happens when you just keep burning things and putting CO2 in the atmosphere? So that's the second reason why we can't afford to ignore our infrastructure, because we need to think about how to decarbonize it. And because most of how we use energy, we use collectively through these collective systems, there's a limit to what you can do as an individual to reduce your carbon footprint,
Right.
because you don't use energy individually, you use energy collectively or as part of these collective systems. Even if you said, I don't care, we're just going to build these systems, we're just going to burn lots of fuel, whatever, we'll be fine. We'll just build new systems and use more energy and it'll be fine.
Mhm.
There's the other problem, which is that all of these systems that I'm focusing on move resources around the planet and through our landscape to where our bodies are.
Mm,
And the problem, of course, is that the stable landscape that they were built for is no longer stable, or it's different than what was currently built. So like Portland had a run of kind of 90 plus degree days last year or 2 years
right.
ago.
Right. Yeah.
And it meant that and London did too, actually. So all of the rail systems were not designed for such hot days, and the rails would expand in the heat. And it meant that they either, I think both cities actually had to suspend some rail service entirely because the rails were no longer safe because they had expanded because it was 10 degrees hotter or 20 degrees hotter than what they had really been designed for. And so the other problem with our infrastructure and climate change is that if we have more storms, if we have more wildfires or more hurricanes or more extreme weather days, then these systems are designed for a landscape that effectively no longer exists. And you can't not have them pass through the landscape. That's kind of what they do, right? They're networks that move things around.
Mhm.
So if the landscape is changing, you're in trouble, right? This is an unignorable problem.
The other sort of interesting tension here is this the difference between sort of like public goods and private companies.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about sort of the role of publicness in infrastructure. And I live in I think a lot of people live in an area where like electricity or the internet is a private company, but it's sort of monopolized because of the way the infrastructure is. And you were talking earlier about sort of non-monetary value in these systems.
Yeah.
And so what happens when infrastructure becomes private, and there is now a business goal that sometimes is maybe counter to making sure that the trains run on time so people get to where they need to be, or that everybody has, drinking water, et cetera, et cetera?
So infrastructural systems, by and large, are not market goods, right? They aren't things where you can just be like, oh, I like this thing, I'm going to buy it, or I'll buy it next week, or I'll buy it if the price falls.
Right, right.
Right. And this is, it sounds kind of dumb, but it's also super obvious, right? Like you can't just get your water next week, right?
Right.
It's even hard to, below a threshold, it's even hard to use less water, right? We need water to survive. And broadly, the same thing is true for things like electricity. It's definitely true for things like, the energy we use to heat our homes. It's also true it's true for things like telecommunications, right? If you're accessing services through the internet, if you don't have access, it's not a thing that you could live without. What that means is, so that's the first thing, right? These are not market goods, right? These typically, if these are things that are built as collective systems because everybody needs them or because most people need them, then they're not things that you can live without. The second piece is because they're about bringing resources to where your body is, and because they're typically built out as networks, they are network monopolies. What that means is that this is why you have like a cable company and a
right.
electric provider, right? And there's a little bit of finessing where it's like we have a network, but you have different people providing it. But really, there's just kind of one network that comes to your house. And you don't get to choose between 3 different water suppliers to your house, right? And because it's one physical network that brings water to your house. And what that means is that if you are unhappy, you can't change your provider, right? And so we, so we frown on monopolists. And the reason why we frown on corporations having monopoly powers, because we understand that they are ripe for exploitation, right? That if you have a monopoly, you can charge people whatever you want to charge them and they will pay for it. And that's dangerous enough in general, which is why, we have things like federal antitrust legislation around monopolies. But it's catastrophic when you're thinking in terms of things that are basic human needs. And in fact, it is a staple of dystopian science fiction to have fully privatized water, right? And it's you have to, it's, the sort of, we live in a world where it's like, if you don't have enough money to pay for water, you suffer. So that's actually, it turns out that's actually even only half of the story, right? That's bad enough. The other part of the story is that all of these systems typically rely on shared common pool resources, right? So whether that's water in the environment, whether that's the wireless spectrum, right? Which is that there's one wireless spectrum that's shared by all of our wireless telecommunications, whether that's the CO2, our shared atmosphere that we're putting CO2 into. All of these systems, they're not, these are material systems that are embedded in the world. And that means that they have an impact on people who live in the world, which is all of us. And so the other piece of it is that you can make an enormous amount of money on infrastructural systems because you're providing something that's not a market good. It's possible for you to have a network monopoly, but also because the resources that you're using to provide those goods are often coming from our shared environments. The waste that's generated is similarly being put in our shared environments. And that often means that there are externalities that are not monetary and that may not be accounted for, right? So for example, if you put CO2 in the atmosphere, we're going to have to deal with we are starting to deal with the consequences of that. It's not a thing that either the company or the person who bought the fuel really paid for. And, if you have a company that, is responsible for sewage and puts untreated sewage into the, local water systems, right? That's not a thing that is measured in dollars, right? That's a thing that's measured in quality of life. That's a thing that's measured in your kids getting sick.
Right.
And so all of this together, the sort of network monopoly piece, the fact that these are not market goods, the fact that they're universal, which means that they usually cannot be treated as something you can postpone until later. Right. And the fact that they draw on shared environments means that they really, really, really do not lend themselves to for-profit corporations, because the moral hazard of doing the absolute minimum you can get away with in terms of maintenance, in terms of the environment, in terms of, the human costs, and also charging the absolute maximum that you can get away with, since you have a captive audience because it's a network monopoly, means that it's always a challenge. And one of the ways in which we can address this challenge is through extremely careful regulation, and extremely, heavy duty regulation. And we're not actually all that amazing at this, right? Which is why we all know stories of, sewage companies that dump water, or untreated
Right.
environmental issues. So like typically one way or another, we end up paying the cost as a society, right? Through regulation or through remediation or whatever. There is no guarantee that not-for-profit collective systems, whether that's mutual aid or co-ops or, traditional municipal or public systems, there's no guarantee that they will, not do these things, right? But at least they don't have the moral hazard of trying to make a profit and not try to do the minimum of everything else, right? At least
Mm,
nominally, they they will incorporate these non-monetary quality of life, quality of the environment type externalities for the people that they serve. And ultimately, no company cares about the well-being of your children. That's not their job.
right. Right.
And but we do,
Right.
right?
Right.
And we are the beneficiaries of things that were created for our well-being. And I've done a huge amount, obviously I've done a huge amount of research in this field, and I have any number of stories of private systems that became public because this understanding of like, yeah, you can make a ton of money off of this, and that means you're making it off, you're that essentially you're making that money off of the people who need the service that you're providing, and that means we'd be much better off providing it as a public service, right? That's basically the history of most utilities in major cities, in many, many, many major cities, many of these utilities. And so if we just kind of recognize that outright and act accordingly, then that opens up the path to move forward. And the other thing, of course, is that the reason why governments make enormous investments in public infrastructure is because there is an understanding that it both underpins the quality of life of the people who live there, and also it underpins economic productivity,
Mm,
right?
hmm.
And so it's not like this is like it's in opposition to economic growth or in opposition to capitalism. It is really just saying, look, capitalism is great for things that are in the market, but these are not market goods, and we want to use a different system, and historically have used a different system for public goods, for things that rely on common pool resources, for things that are significant contributors to quality of life or even just straight survival.
What's really interesting to me here is, so many of these systems were designed by people before I was born. They
Mhm.
were put in place before I was born. They were not always accounting for me, for the next generation, for
Right.
how our lives will change. And it's also really easy to think about infrastructure globally, massively, to think about these things as like incredibly large.
Right.
And towards the end of the book, you start talking about, I don't really know what else to call them, sort of alternative structures,
Mhm.
sort of emerging ways to think about infrastructure. And I'm really interested to hear you talk about sort of this move between the individual and the collective. You have this term infrastructural citizenship,
Mhm.
which was a phrase that was new to me. Can you talk about that and talk about sort of how we as individuals, and also maybe as like smaller communities, not just humans generally, but neighborhoods, local collectives, how we can think about infrastructure at these smaller scales to start to make these changes that you're talking about.
Yeah. So the idea of infrastructural citizenship is we think of citizenship as a relationship that we have between other people who have the same passports, right? Other people
Mm.
from the same country, and there might be some cultural commonalities. There absolutely is you have a right to live in these sort of typically proximate areas, and that you have some sense of responsibility to other people with the same citizenship, and you also are a beneficiary of this relationship, right? And so, and the idea of nation states and citizenships is not actually that old, relatively speaking. And so the point that I made, and the thing I think about in terms of infrastructural citizenship, is that we all have bodies, and those bodies are somewhere on the planet, and those bodies have needs for resources. And no matter where you are, you have a sort of a similar set of needs. And so we've built out these systems to bring resources to where they're used. And so that could be, water, that could actually be taking away things like sewage, but that's also like electricity or power to do things. And what this means is that we might be linked to each other because we have a common passport, but we're really linked to each other because we all have bodies, and those bodies are somewhere in the landscape, and we are linked to each other through that landscape and the networks that traverse this landscape, because we're physical beings in a physical physical world. And this has nothing to do with what your passport says, right? And this has to do with like who you live near, or not even live near, but who you are presently near, and what resources are kind of in the environment around you. And the other thing about infrastructural citizenship is that relationship not only exists today, but I know that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, maybe even 1,000 years from now, there are also going to be people humans with the similar basic needs, living in the same places where we live today, just as they lived here 50 or 100 years or 1,000 years ago. And so the idea of infrastructural citizenship is to sort of expand out from this idea of who do we have responsibility to and why, into this recognition that, the national borders kind of aren't it, right? What it is the actual physical environment that we live in. Having said that, the relevant size of that is going to be highly dependent on what the system is and where you live. So I live in the Northeast. It rains a lot. My entire water supply is, within, 25 or so miles of where I live, kind of 40 odd kilometers of where I live. And that is not true if you live in the West. If you live, or at least if you live in the Southwest of the US. If you live in the North, it can be a little bit different, right? So the appropriate scale for water in the Northeast might be, under 50 miles, under 100 kilometers. That may not be the case for lots of the Southwest. The appropriate scale for transportation, maybe it's the entire continent, right? For ground transportation is the entire continent. The appropriate scale for telecommunications is absolutely global, right? We take it for granted that we have connections to people kind of no matter where on the globe that they live. And so basically this is essentially recognizing these systems as relationships between each other, and then the natural sort of size or scale for those may or may not map onto sort of existing political boundaries. And as new technologies are developed, and as we figure out how we are going to transform these systems, particularly because of climate change, then there may be different scales that make more sense in a way that they might not have made sense, 50 years ago.
I want to sort of take this conversation and change it as we head into the end and talk about your teaching work and your work at Olin, because I think that's actually very related to what you were just talking about. And so you're an engineering professor at Olin, and you were sort of involved with helping start that and sort of thinking about what a new type of engineering school would be. Can you tell me a little bit first about how you got involved with that and what the goals were with sort of this new ways of thinking about teaching engineering?
Sure. So I have a fairly traditional, technical engineering professor background. I did my graduate work at the University of Toronto. I did a postdoc at MIT. But I was always interested in academic governance, and I was really always interested in teaching. So when Olin opened, and they were just, recruiting faculty, I went to a talk at MIT that was, hey, we're starting this new college. We're looking for people who are interested in these things. And I thought, this is the thing I want to do. And I applied and I got the job.
Okay, nice.
So I know it's actually like I cannot believe that they were hiring someone who had in material science, which is my field, at the exact moment I was looking for a position. It's one of the great, wonderful coincidences of my life. So Olin was founded with the idea of thinking about how we teach engineering students differently. And with very much what I think about now, I think about as sort of professional skills. So the ability to work in teams, the ability to sort of solve open-ended problems, to think about the sort of the larger context, returning a little bit to engineering as kind of a hands-on design thing, as opposed to the sort of math and science. My undergraduate degree is all math and science, basically. So getting away from that and getting a little bit more into you can solve real problems in the real world. So that was a piece of it and a piece of why we were founded. Over the course of getting the college up and running, we realized that we had kind of semi-inadvertently and then quite deliberately created a set of circumstances that really fostered motivation in students. And my colleague, John Stoke, was one of the people who did a lot of work in this. And Edward Deasy is the psychology researcher who's most associated with this. So the idea is that that people are not motivated or unmotivated, that their engagement is predicated on the circumstances that they're in. And for folks to be motivated, and particularly in educational contexts, they need kind of three things. They need to have some autonomy, so some control over what they're doing. They need to have a purpose, which often takes the form of community, so doing things because the people around you are doing it. And they need to have what DC calls competency development, which is, I think of as sort of scaffolding, right? To know that you're getting better at something. So, we realize that doing things like, we're going to have open-ended engineering design projects where students are going to work in teams and they're going to pick a topic that they're interested in. And we as professors will provide the scaffolding in which they will like learn and work. And we realized that this really dovetailed with these ideas around motivation. And so that gave us the opportunity to really focus on that side of it. So it was less, vocational, these are the skills that the marketplace wants in engineers, and a lot more, these are the things that really help people learn, right? And help people be motivated to learn. And so that became for many of us, that became kind of our larger focus, to think about how do we create learning experiences that really foster this kind of engagement. And so that's partly how I started off as someone who's like a very technically focused person. I taught material science and bioengineering, and then started moving more into teaching engineering design and to thinking about these sort of learning experiences where I'm helping my students develop really the metacognition and the tools of reflective practice that they will then use. And the form, and I teach our first year students the first semester engineering design course. And I really think about it as creating the learning experiences that allow them to develop this set of tools as designers, as as people who bring ideas into the world. And that ended up being my real focus as an educator over the course of the last kind of 10 or 15 years.
I'm really interested in this as a graphic design professor, where graphic design is also I do not mean to compare graphic design to engineering here, but it has a very technical component, or historically it had a very technical component, and a lot of that sort of doesn't work anymore, just with the sort of changes in the profession. And so I was really interested in the way I've heard you talk about engineering education. I've heard you refer to this before as the sort of Tetris versus Minecraft model. Can you talk about that metaphor and how that has become like a way for you to sort of think about the classroom?
Yeah, for sure. So I love playing Tetris, like many people do. And the thing that makes Tetris really satisfying is that it is all competency development, right? As you do a thing, you know exactly what you're doing. You don't have very much autonomy, right? It's like you're just moving those little blocks around. But it's super addictive, right? It's very Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi style flow, right? That it's because it's being pitched to you at exactly the right level. And that's really what my undergrad was, right? It was like, I just did a whole bunch of problem sets, and the problem sets were like super satisfying. And the next one was like slightly harder than the previous one. And it was like playing Tetris. But like playing Tetris, it was individually focused, right? In many cases, it didn't have an apparent larger purpose beyond itself. And I'm not saying that everything has to. I think things can be just fun, right? I don't think that everything should be productive. I think games and play are really important. But so the thing I compared it to was learning how to play Minecraft and playing Minecraft, where, most of the kids I know play Minecraft, you play it with other people. So you like learn how to do things, or you do it because you want to be on a Minecraft server with your friends. it's a lot harder. It's a lot more open-ended, which means that it's a lot, often harder to figure out what to do, which is why there are like YouTube tutorials.
Hmm.
And it's a different, it's not even so much that it's differently or more motivating. It's that it has a different weighting of the, I said the three factors were kind of autonomy, competency development, and purpose or community.
Right.
And it has a really different weighting that instead of really focusing on the competency development scaffolding piece, it really emphasizes the autonomy piece and the community piece. And so one of the ways in which I think about the engineering education that we do is that we often have a somewhat different weighting, right? One that basically has is weighted more towards Minecraft and less towards Tetris. But partly it's actually just having a broader range of potential kinds of experiences for
Mm,
students. So like if you don't
right.
want to play Tetris, right, there's now
Right.
other possibilities, right? Versus the only way you can become an engineer is by playing Tetris. And also because it's not really clear that like playing Tetris prepares you for a world that's a lot more like playing Minecraft.
How does that change your role as teacher, professor, facilitator in the classroom when you are thinking about not just saying like here's how you play Tetris, but here are all the possibilities within Minecraft? That sort of changes what you have to do. How do you think about that?
So one of the ways in which I think about it is I think of myself as designing learning experiences, where I think
Mm,
about what am I hoping that students what are they trying to learn how to do, and then what kind of experiences can they have that will help them get to that point. So that's the first piece of it is just instead of just I'm going to write a syllabus, it's much more of a focus on what those learning experiences are. There's
mm,
also quite a bit more letting go. So I definitely, and one of the reasons why I
yeah.
teach design is because I see my role there as I provide the scaffolding to be a designer, but I can't, and this I'm sure will sound very, very familiar to you, Jarrett. The actual act of design has to come from students, right? They have to
Right.
practice it and they have to learn how to
Right.
do it.
Yeah.
And they have to develop the ability to look at what they did and reflect on it and use that to move forward. And so I definitely think of it much more as I'm providing the circumstances and the scaffolding for them to have those experiences, which is really different than, and then, within that scaffolding, they design what they want to design, or they build what they want to build, because the goal is for them to develop that set of skills, not to build a certain thing, much less learn like a certain thing.
Hmm.
And so on the one hand, it's like obviously I think about how do we just create these learning experiences. On the other hand, this is not what my background is, right? I wasn't trained as a design educator, and I love working with my colleagues who were, and in fact, one of my main professional goals is to level up
Mm,
as a design educator by collaborating with and observing and learning from my design colleagues, because I feel like they are the ones who like this is their stock and
right.
trade to help teach your students how to think about this within this field, rather than having them learn to have sort of specific like I can do X, Y, and Z. Basically have them develop the ability to do what they're doing, make decisions about it, see how they did, reflect on it, and make new decisions moving forward. So I feel like at the high level, it's like I'm designing these learning experiences, and particularly at the sort of interaction level, I'm always, trying to learn how to help support my students better as they go through this process, which we all understand is a really challenging transition.
I have one more question sort of about that I'm hoping will then connect back to the book also.
Mhm.
Because one of the themes throughout all of your work is this ideas of care, ideas of systems of care, ideas of repair. You wrote that piece for the Atlantic, I Am Not a Maker, which was about ideas of repair, and that comes through in the book too. That to think about these systems, part of our role when they have been made before is how do we care for them and how do we repair them. And I'm curious how you talk about that in the classroom. I often find, and I'm generalizing here, but young students, they want to make new things, they want to innovate, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of value in talking about repairing things, about caring for things, about stewardship. How do you think about that in an engineering classroom, how do you talk about your students? How do you talk to your students about sort of entering into these systems and I don't know, caretaking, redesigning, repairing, reevaluating?
Yeah, that now I'm like, that is definitely a real question, because certainly, engineering design definitely is still kind of focused on making new things in the
Right,
world.
right.
I teach a course on infrastructure studies, which has a much greater emphasis on sort of maintenance and repair.
Mm,
And so one of the things, so the first thing I think I want to sort of say to this is that I think that there is actually a continuum between sort
mhm.
of maintenance on the one hand and like brand spanking new innovation on the other, right? It passes through renewal, it passes through um so the sort of transformation. And that's especially true. We sort of see this for infrastructure because we very, very rarely, we don't throw everything out and like start over again,
Right,
right? We tend to
right.
build systems on top of each other. We tend to we maintain the systems we have. Um, so getting away from the idea that these things are, in opposition. Um, but uh but like that is a really good point, right? There's a really, really deep bias towards making new things. And certainly I kind of want my students to have that experience of making new things, because a lot of care and maintenance does involve similar sorts of problem solving, right? That
Yeah,
that
yeah.
it might not be like a totally de novo system, but I mean, we've all had the experience of like something broke and we're trying to fix it, and we fix it by figuring out a new way to do things, right? It's like there's always that sort of problem solving
Hmm.
physical piece in the world. So a chunk of it I think is less about we're teaching them how to design and we're not teaching them how to fix things, and more that by teaching them how to make new things, we also to some extent are teaching them how to do that kind of problem solving in existing circumstances. But I wrote that Why I'm Not a Maker piece because I do broadly agree with you, right? That we are much, much better teaching and thinking and valuing doing new things than we are at valuing repair. In the specific context of infrastructure, we're kind of in a weird place, because normally I would be like, we need to maintain our infrastructure. And now I actually think we need to transform it. I mean, we'll maintain, we're not going to rebuild all our water pipes, but there's going to be a giant ton of full on innovation that's going to happen, as well as everything between, right? The renewal, the sort of new systems and new
Right,
kinds of
right.
systems, and then like totally new technologies that didn't exist a century ago. And so there really is, and just as in all of our lives, we have a balance between creating new things and doing care work and doing maintenance work and doing repair. That's, I think, also true at the society level, and it's certainly true for infrastructure. And so I think moving forward, there will be sort of a set of roles.
Mm,
And then, a part of it is actually as a society, valuing all of those roles, not just it's like new, innovative, transformative, but recognizing all those different pieces of it.
I think that's a great way to wrap this up. So I'm going to ask you the question that I used to end all of these conversations. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
So I think this is a galley brag. But the two books that I've been super, super looking forward to, I've just got in my hands in the galley. So I've just started reading them both. And so one of them is a book by Jay Owens called Dust, and it's out in the UK, and it'll
Oh,
be out in the US very soon. Jay used to write a newsletter called Disturbances, and she's been using Dust as a sort of incredible lens into many aspects of our modern world. So that's one of the books. And then the other book is a book called Systems Ultra by George
mm,
Voss. And it's a book not unlike I mean, in both these books, I feel like are very, I mean, I know George and Jay are both friends of mine. They're both kind of close fellow travelers to
mm,
how infrastructure works. So Systems Ultra is again about sort of understanding um these systems. George uses some very specific ones, and the ways in which we have agency within them. So the ways at which we can not just sort of, I'm really kind of focused on these are good systems, let's keep them going. She's really focused on like resistance and as well as sort of repair and rebuilding, right? All of
right.
the manifold ways in which we interact with these systems. So that's Dust by Jay Owens and Systems Ultra by George Voss. And Systems Ultra, I think, will be out in the US in January. So I've been excited about both these books coming down the pike for a while. And so I'm super excited to be reading them both.
Well, your book is called How Infrastructure Works Inside the Systems That Shape Our World. I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Deb, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Jarrett.
And that was my conversation with Deb Chachra. It was recorded on September 14th, 2023. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu, whose new album, In Electric Time, is out now. The show is and always will be free thanks to the generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you like what we're doing here, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us on social media at Surface Podcast. You can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.